Senator Xenophon.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I welcome the opportunity to speak on the seemingly complex and vexed issue of the Australian Government's procurement process and how it serves, or rather doesn't serve, the Australian people. I say seemingly vexed and complex because it shouldn't be that hard, Mr Acting Deputy President, to do the right thing by Australian manufacturers and Australian jobs. And this is something, this is why I've been so pleased to work with Senator Madigan on this inquiry. We've co-sponsored this motion, and I pay tribute to Senator Madigan for the work that he's done on it and initiating this. Now, Senator Madigan and I helped to set up an inquiry into the process because we are concerned that the procurement processes do not serve the interests of the Australian people, surely the first and foremost task of any government. And in my home state of South Australia, the Honourable John Daly MLC, a member of the Legislative Council, elected with my full backing and endorsement, re-elected at the recent South Australian election, has also worked on issues of procurement, and recently we worked on issues with respect to office supplies procurement, where the South Australian Government, I think, made some fundamental mistakes that discriminated against local suppliers. Now, Mr Acting Deputy President, some might recall our repeated attempts to have the Parliament House dining room supplied with fine Australian-made crockery. We even sourced an extensive set made here in Australia at our own expense with Senator Madigan and I. The crockery succeeded in making the news, but unfortunately has yet to see the inside of the members' and guest dining room. In fact, as Senator Madigan said, the status and whereabouts of the crockery set is unknown. The government took it, or the Parliament rather took it, but isn't using it. What a waste, Mr Acting Deputy President. The Senate Finance and Public Administration References Committee inquiry has heard a range of views so far, and I've been impressed by the level of engagement with the issue, especially from Australian industry and union representatives. Submissions have also been received from several Commonwealth departments as well as academic lawyers concerned that Australia should not break its free trade agreements by, quote, discriminating against foreign suppliers. And I'll say more on that later. Commonwealth procurement policy intersects with our relations with free trade partners and our region and our status in the World Trade Organisation. But it also has a massive impact on the Australian economy and almost all local industries. It is hard to find a sector of the local economy that isn't impacted by Commonwealth procurement. Australian government procurement is estimated at $41 billion a year. It's 10% of the Commonwealth budget and accounts for 2.5% of the national economy. As one witness to the inquiry said, and I quote, "Australian government procurement is equivalent in turnover to Australia's entire hotel and restaurant sector." So we are not talking about a sideshow here. For many sectors and industries in Australia, it is the main game in town. Yet Australia, it's the main show in town rather, and yet Australia has gotten a reputation internationally of taking a narrow view of its options in relation to procurement. A narrow and short-term view of so-called best value for money and a black-letter interpretation of our free trade obligations have come to dominate this and the previous government's thinking. Unfortunately, the word is spreading. A few years ago, I had a conversation with Michael O'Connor, the National Secretary of the CMFEU, in relation to issues of dumping. And he recalled to me a comment passed by a Scandinavian at a timber industry forum in Scandinavia a few years back. No sooner had Mr O'Connor introduced himself and said he was from Australia, did the Scandinavian official quip that he laughed. He said, "You're from Australia, you are the free trade Taliban," because Australia takes such a fundamentalist and literalist and purist approach to free trade that no other country in the world does. We are being mugs, Mr Acting Deputy President. It marks us out as extremists, naive at best and at worst ideologues without the spark to know our best interests. I believe it is the role of senators and political leaders in general to determine what our policy should be in the future. We cannot bury our head in the sand and mutter the tired old slogans of the past. As has been written, the past is another country. We must be concerned about Australia's future and how Australia's manufacturers and producers can prosper while fitting into the world economy. There can be no place for ideology, for fixed dogma on an issue that directly affects the livelihoods of so many. There's serious work to do, both within the inquiry and outside it, informing a debate about how the Commonwealth can lead the way. Senator Madigan has strong and, in my view, well-considered opinions on this, and I share them. His links to the people of Victoria's manufacturing base are strong. He was onto something last week in the inquiry which resonated with me very much when he picked up on the issue of Commonwealth procurement policy and a so-called ban on, quote, discrimination against foreign suppliers. Now, Senator Madigan said the government procurement policy says they are not allowed to discriminate against a foreign product in procurement. Other countries might use the term discernment as to what they purchase. So in our case, here in Australia, the word discriminate replaces being discerning. So here in Australia, in our case in Australia, we should use the word discriminate, replacing the words being discerning. Sorry, I'll say it again. So in our case here in Australia, the word discriminate should be replaced with being discerning in how we practice procurement. This surely is a call for a return to a wider application of national interest in procurement and a wider definition of value for money, one that takes into consideration the longer-term and wider benefits to Australia, as well as the true cost of engaging foreign suppliers. And in terms of value for money, let's put this in perspective. If we buy some drill bits from another country which might be 40 or 50% cheaper, but only last a tenth as long as Australian-made drill bits, and Senator Madigan, as a practising blacksmith, has got a lot of experience in relation with these sorts of issues, and I believe him, then where is the value for money? It is a superficial approach. We need to, in terms of durability, we need to look very closely at what so-called value for money means in the context of Commonwealth procurement policies. We need to make sure that if we're buying something that is seemingly cheaper, that it doesn't mean that it will last for a fraction of the time of an Australian-made product. A straight price comparison between an Australian product and one from overseas doesn't tell the full story, not by a long shot. The value to Australia of sourcing native goods starts with the initial purchase and then keeps on going. It includes security of employment, higher standards of manufacturing, confidence that minimum environmental, social and employment conditions have been met, and the multiplier effect of government money fanning out throughout the Australian economy. By comparison, $1 spent on a foreign source product appears to leave the country immediately. And this is critical stuff, Mr Acting Deputy President. Why? Because in my home state of South Australia, we have seen the demise of General Motors Holden, a great tragedy for our state. But that will mean thousands of jobs are potentially on the line in the whole supply base in the terms of the automotive component manufacturers who are really state-of-the-art, who are really cutting edge. And if they are to have any chance of surviving in the longer term, we need to also set the lead by example in terms of Commonwealth procurement policy, so that they can have a fighting chance in terms of expanding their markets or developing new markets. Now, the inquiry heard that the standards by which overseas products were made, be them employment conditions, product standards or environmental safeguards, were generally not checked or even checkable by our government. The inquiry heard detailed evidence from paper manufacturers and their industry representatives, as well as paper consumers from government departments. We are not talking about a few reams of copy paper here. The Australian government uses about 600,000 tonnes of paper a year across more than 20 Commonwealth departments and agencies. Only 2 departments, Defence and Human Services, sourced Australian paper, we heard. Admittedly, due to the size of these departments, Australian paper makes up 57% of the total, but the question has to be asked, why does it make up 100% of the total? But it appears from evidence to the inquiry that when purchasing paper made in Indonesia or Germany or Austria, which we do, there was no way of checking the suppliers pledged that it was made from 50% recycled sources, that it didn't use, for instance, rainforest timber. Now, the Australian Tax Office purchases paper from Indonesia stamped 50% recycled. One would hope the label is true because Indonesia is fast running out of its old growth rainforests, and that has something to do with orangutan habitats and palm oil and other related issues. And I could go on about that, but I'm already banned from Malaysia and I don't necessarily want to be banned from Indonesia anytime soon. But Australia's Forest Products Association is rightly frustrated with the CEO, Ross Hampton, telling the inquiry, and I quote, "As far as our departments are asked to look, that is the point. They have a list and they click on a box that says that it is 50% recycled, they tick it and they move on, and then they are into the lowest price. Mr Hampton goes on to say, it goes to the heart of what we are talking about, because no one does look further than the label at the moment. That is what's happening. You get the label and it says 50% recycled, tick. But who can blame the government, Mr Acting Deputy President, for taking overseas labels at face value? It clearly couldn't afford to send investigators to all corners of the world to verify the claims made by foreign manufacturers in order to win supply contracts, nor could it. That would be insane. So we are left with the so-called relative sanity of taking environmental and other labels at face value. And we heard at the inquiry just last Friday that you can just buy a $10 rubber stamp and just stamp that it's certified, or that it's environmentally friendly, or whatever standards it's supposed to meet in another country, and we've got no way of checking that. We need to look seriously at having a situation where we can insist on having almost an onus of proof on those overseas suppliers that they are complying. There must be a more rigorous standard rather than us having to go and check whether they comply. We are told, though, that to do this could be discriminatory, and discrimination would breach Commonwealth procurement policy as well as our various free trade deals. But to use Senator Madigan's wording, we aren't being discerning, and we need to be discerning. Applied across the width and breadth of our $4 billion procurement program, this view hobbles our national interest. You don't hear the rest of the world complaining much, do you? In short, we are being taken for mugs. A similar point can be made about furniture manufacturing standards and the various environmental and employment standards met by local companies. And by way of contrast, in my own home state of South Australia, Molnar hoists in Adelaide, it ticks off on all the categories of safety, of reliability, of spare parts, in terms of social, economic and environmental factors, and a better resale value. Yet, why do they have to compete in such an unlevel playing field? Mr Acting Deputy President, this issue has much in common with Australia's poor record on dumped imports. The much vaunted level playing field does not exist for many Australian manufacturers and producers, given the difficulty of lodging an action against dumping and the stance taken by the Commonwealth on matters of international trade. There have been improvements, and I acknowledge the work that was done by the former government in relation to that. They needed to go much further, but I am grateful for some of those changes, and I urge this government to take the changes even further and to give that support for small and medium manufacturers. The case involving South Australian tissue paper producer Kimberly-Clark and dumped goods from China and Indonesia is telling. The case led me to introduce a private senator's bill, the Customs Amendment Anti-Dumping Bill in 2010. In the case of Kimberly-Clark, the government imposed dumping duties on Chinese and Indonesian tissue products in 2008 after investigations found that Chinese products were being sold at 2 to 25% below the cost in its domestic market, while Indonesian toilet paper was found to have been dumped at 33 to 45% below value. But this decision was overruled in 2009 following a review by the Trade Measures Branch of Australian Customs, which determined that there was, quote, no material injury to Australian manufacturing as a result of these dumped imports. So that was to many saw that as a bizarre decision that wasn't in the national interest, that wasn't fair, that didn't even stick to the letter or spirit of the WTO. Now, this, I believe that we need to reform our anti-dumping laws, which in turn will impact on our Commonwealth procurement policies. The Kimberly-Clark case highlights my ongoing concerns about an absence of fair treatment from the Commonwealth towards Australian manufacturers. And of course, I balance the call for a reframing of Commonwealth procurement with some caution. I support the Australian Industries Group's sensible submission to the inquiry that the Commonwealth must continue to adhere to the established principles of best practice in procurement. But that best practice must include a reasonable, a robust consideration of what best value for money is. I agree with the AI Group's view that best practice, far from a buzzword for management boffins, can be a guide for a government seeking savings for its budget. The AI Group says no areas or agencies of government should be off limits to the application of best practice principles such as efficiency, effectiveness, transparency and equity in government expenditure. But the key point on procurement is how wide to frame the value proposition for the nation. The AA Group makes the point as good as anyone. Government should take a long-term and holistic approach when applying these principles to individual costs and expenditure items. The emphasis should be on value for money over the whole life of a product or service, and should take into account factors such as risk, reliability and future maintenance costs. Mr Acting Deputy President, the AA Group said that the major barriers and distortions for local suppliers to the Commonwealth were an undue emphasis on upfront costs rather than the whole-of-life costs in government procurement. This emphasis resulted in the purchase of lower-quality goods and services and neglected the costs involved in maintenance and through-life support, which were key advantages that local suppliers were able to offer. Now, if this process gets us anywhere, Mr Acting Deputy President, I'd like to see the Commonwealth assess and quantify the wider, long-term and indirect benefits to Australia of engaging local supplier. And the IA Group puts it in these terms: government spending measures should be assessed holistically so that any spillover benefits that are not easy to quantify are taken into account. Mr Acting Deputy President, we should be quantifying these benefits so that we can target and achieve them through Commonwealth procurement. The AA Group's concerns must be listened to. They represent 60,000 businesses in manufacturing, engineering, construction, automotive, food, transport and many other sectors. Hundreds of thousands of employees are represented by them. 1 million, I correct myself. 1 million Australians are represented by the business. This is about the national interest of Australia and Australians. Labor's Australians Jobs Bill the ALP's Australians Jobs Bill last year addressed similar concerns to those of procurement, but I believe it was the thresholds and the bars were set too high. A report from the Prime Minister's Task Force on Manufacturing in August 2012 estimated that 950,000 people were employed in the manufacturing sector, and it contributes 8% of our gross domestic product directly. This does not include the significant amount that it contributes indirectly through flow-on effects of other businesses. The report also stated that over the previous 4 years, over 100,000 jobs disappeared from the manufacturing sector. We have to stop being mugs when other countries are laughing about us because we are such purists when it comes to free trade. This means that 100,000 families around the nation were affected by this plunge in employment in our manufacturing sector. Now, we can go further by reframing Commonwealth procurement. I'd like to finish by highlighting a very important example of Commonwealth procurement that would be transformed by a better application of a national interest test, and that is defence shipbuilding. Right now, the Commonwealth is weighing what additional warships it will ask local industry to construct in coming years, if any. Defence has indicated it will need to acquire 80 ships for the Navy in coming years, estimated to cost about $100 billion. The so-called Valley of Death awaits many thousands of shipbuilding workers in Victoria, New South Wales and particularly in my home state of South Australia, and indeed in other parts of the country. To quote a witness to the inquiry, Dr Tom Skladzian, the National Economic Advisor to the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, it's better to have a defence industry and not need one than need one and not have one. Now, Dr Skladzian well articulated these concerns in terms of defence procurement, and I would urge honourable senators to look at his remarks and his evidence. Now, it's a stark picture that we face, but it isn't a stretch to see the same peaks and troughs, boom and bust patterns stretching across the economic and social fabric of the nation, driven by short-sighted procurement policy. The Commonwealth's procurement regime could reasonably be a latter-day free trade-inspired cargo cult. It's not serving Australians, and more of us are waking up to it. The United States and Europe woke up long ago. The United States is the greatest free trade country in history, yet can find a way to act in the best economic interests of its people. Just look at the tough and controversial negotiations it is having with Australia on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. It's fair to say that the US and Europe operate on a completely different level to Australia in relation to local suppliers and industries. We must be less credulous of the rest of the world, clear-eyed about their own national interests, yet aware of the benefits of free trade over time. Commonwealth procurement should not be couched in terms of discrimination, nor driven by desire to be whiter than the driven snow on free trade. We cannot afford to be so naive. Rather, it's about framing decisions about Commonwealth procurement more realistically, more fully, recognising the true benefits of a sustained, competitive and responsive local supplies base. In the end, it's about us no longer being taken for mugs.